Our next speaker is Alex Bordei. He is the Director of Product and Development at Bigstep. He will offer us a technical perspective on the impact of GDPR on big data. Alex is a developer turned into product manager. He has been developing infrastructure products for over 10 years before becoming Bigstep's Director of Engineering. Welcome, Alex.
So just look at this one. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Right. So that was a fantastic presentation, at least for me. So this talk is basically a technical guy perspective on what GDPR is and how that impacts us in the big data field. Before I get started, I'm just going to do a quick show of hands on who has looked deeply or deeper into what GDPR is. Right, so that's about like 30% of you, which is fantastic. Who's from non-technical field, as in like marketing? Right, business-ish. So it's like 20% of them. Cool. So you all know about GDPR and what it means. It's already in effect, by the way. I mean, it's already approved, voted, and it will actually come into effect in May 2018. So this is what's written on their website. So it says like it's the biggest change in data regulation for the last, in 20 years. So they actually have a countdown on the website that tells you that this is important and this is serious. So we need to pay a little bit more attention to it. So again, I'm a technical guy, and we've been talking about this because my feel is that since big data has been in use for the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, at a lot of organizations, I think it has now become apparent that it's not only useful, but it is also very, let's say, dangerous to some degree. And in certain situations, with all its power, it can create a lot of harm. So what my understanding after all these talks is that when everything that I've read about GDPR and all the lawyers that I've talked to, is that there are certain situations in which big data can do harm, not just good. So what I'm going to try to do is show you what I found in terms of what's harm, what can be harmful with big data, and why it has been introduced, sort of a summary of what GDPR is from my perspective and what it introduces, as well as some technical solutions to the problems that it raises. And I do hope you all you stop me or raise your hands and stop me if you have questions, because I hate to have this sort of a TED talk. All right, so again, a cool disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, and these views are my own. So do seek professional advice before you embark on something. Right. So what's new here is that there's a 20 million euro cap on the fines that you can get from GDPR, or 4% of the global revenue, the maximum of those, whichever is greater. So for big organizations, that's really, really a sizable amount. So it, again, emphasizes the fact that this is important, and the regulators will actually make sure that you do your job in applying this. So it's not just words and another sort of regulation that you can, it's optionally for you to apply. It's actually really important for everybody to take into account and think about it. So one of the problems why GDPR was introduced to try to solve that is the fact that artificial intelligence apparently has a tendency of amplifying existing bias in a society, which means that if a data set contains information that's derived from people that are not necessarily racist, but let's say they have a bias within the data set, the algorithm that gets trained on top of that data set will have the same bias as the people that were observed, right? And to give you an example, there's a study done by Harvard University saying that if you look for and it's a sizable study. And if you search on Google a word that has this black connotation, that it sounds as if it's a name of a black individual, he is more likely, with 25% more likely to find ads, so not search results, but ads containing some reference to arrests or arrest records. versus white people. So I'm not saying Google is racist or anything. I'm just saying that probably the algorithms that Google has have amplified this situation in society. So it already tries to have, already has effects. Another situation. So apparently you can actually be in the shadow of big data because there has been an application in Boston, this mobile application called Streetbomb that you install on your smartphone and that you use as you move through Boston to identify potholes, and it uses like solar matter and the GPS, and it's a really cool and useful application for them. But what they found is that apparently lower income and elderly people live in areas with no potholes, which of course it's false because they just don't have enough data from there. So those groups are underrepresented, right? So they lack the information. So that will, of course, if the authority would make decisions based solely on the data from this street bump application, that particular group of people will be ignored or at least not treated properly. Also, algorithms already affect the reputation of people, right? So this is another example. There have been 2 cases in Germany where a businessman sued Google for the autocomplete results because his name was associated automatically with Scientology and fraud, right? He won the case because it wasn't the case, right? There wasn't no connection between his name, but that affected his reputation. Then the same was for the wife of a former president, which was associated with escort services. So it has tremendous impact for people that are regularly being searched on Google, even before people hit enter. So this has, of course, and I've seen references today about the increasing mistrust in other people handling personal data, or particular corporations having access to that, especially due to all the breaches that we have. So apparently, users are very, very afraid of giving out their personal information to other institutions than the public sector and the financial services. Everything else, if you can see, it's in single digits. So what happens is that they are actually bullied into providing personally identifiable information because there was no other way of accessing the services, right? So within this climate, GDPR was introduced to try to solve some of these issues. And the way they thought about doing it is by introducing several new citizen rights. Right? So if you're a citizen in the European Union, all across the world really, because all services will have to align to this if they need to service European customers, is that they will have 3 new rights, right? The right of access, and this means that citizens will be able to ask the provider to tell him or her what it's being done with the data. He or she will have the right to be able to choose what specific things are being done with that particular data. They will have the ability to ask to receive the data that a provider has on them, as well as to delete the data from the respective servers, and to be able to get the data from Facebook and move it to High Five or some other platform. Just be able to package that up in a format that another vendor can use and just move it across vendors. So these are the rights that new citizens will have. But this also comes with new vendor obligations, right? So we'll have the obligation to implement privacy by design. And this is what I've seen Laureen talking about in the previous slide. So they've on purposely collected less information that they needed. I mean, they're not collecting everything that they can. They are just collecting the minimum amount of information that they need to do whatever they set out to do. They've also invested heavily in securing the data, even if it's for a POC. So privacy by design is something that is going to be very, very important. When a regulator will come and ask any of you, have you applied privacy by design, you need to say, yes, we've thought about this from the get-go. Also, there's obligation to report data breaches, to perform data protection impact, and appoint somebody that's actually in charge of doing all of this. Right. So this is at times at odds with big data in general. And it is because, first of all, the right of access that I've been talking about is hard to apply because it's very hard to explain from the beginning what the particular use will be for the data, because in the big data world, what we typically tend to do is not have a clear goal from the get-go. We sometimes reuse data and repurpose it for other purposes. Sometimes I get started with the data set and then midway I figure out what I want to do with that. Or maybe there was an initial goal, but then along the way we've turned it into something else. Also, there's a tendency of gathering everything, right? So up until this point, whenever we would be talking about data lakes, the point was gather as much data as you can because you'll be able to use it later, even if you don't know what you want to do with that today. But GDPR says no, stop doing that. Start collecting exactly what you need. So it's a bit of a problem. Also, GDPR has this big area where they talk about profiling. And profiling is now being regulated. And it's regulated because, again, algorithms have a lot of power. So big data does do a lot of profiling. So we need to know, whenever we are designing new big data systems, we need to know how we can circumvent all these issues and to take everything into account. Right, so what we've seen as we've talked with various customers is that what they are trying to do nowadays, whenever they set up the data lake or the data laboratory as they call it, they have started to place a lot more emphasis on the black box there, which is, this is an example of a data lake done with open source components, just for the sake of it so that you can recognize the technologies. But what's important there is the data catalog and the meta store, right, that we've been talking about. That's important not just because it helps you find data in your data lake or your data laboratory, but it's also important because it helps you locate the data sources from which you got data into your data lake so that you can delete the data from there. It also helps you identify the data from those respective sources that can deliver it back to the customer should he want it. So that metadata or store or data catalog that does data lineage will be a lot more important. One example of it is Apache Atlas. There are other technologies as well, like Informatica or Talend, Collibra for doing that, but it is started to become a lot more important. So whenever you start doing a data laboratory, think about adding that component. If you haven't done it until now, try to do it because it will become a lot more important. Also, a data laboratory helps you explore the data that you have so that before you ask for consent from your customers, and Lauren talked about consent because you will need to have consent for the data that you gather, and we'll talk more about it at the profiling end when we talk about profiling. To get consent from your customer, you need to explicitly explain what that data is going to be used for. And because you don't know a priori, it's good to explore the data a little bit before you embark on just collecting data, right? So try to get the data that you currently have, put it in your system, look at it, try to figure out what you want to do so that you can expand the scope of what you want to do with the data and then put that on the website. So again, getting back to the meta store, there are tools out there that can also help not just with data lineage, but also with data access control. So it will help you implement that privacy by design aspect that the GDPR is asking you to do, because you have access to what data, who has access to which data, you can control access to it, and there are various technologies that allows you to do that. Yeah, so this was an example was Apache Atlas. Is anybody using Apache Atlas at some point? No? Okay, so try to take a look at it. It's from Hortonworks. Okay, so what data protection by design and by default means. So obviously, collecting data and not anonymizing it or not keeping it protected is obviously something that you need to avoid now. So you cannot just say, hey, well, we've collected it and that was it. So you need to design it to be private or as protected as possible from the get-go, right? And the way to do that is to try to anonymize it, but it's not as easy as you would think. So anonymizing data doesn't, just removing the name of a person from a data set doesn't mean that that data is anonymous, because there's such a thing called re-identification, and there's a lot of situations in which you can take presumably anonymized data and re-identify the persons which are actually in the data set. And have been many cases, like there was at one point some anonymized health data was shared in the US, and the health data of a governor in the US from one of the states was identified. And the way you do that is by correlating it with external data sets. Right? So you have one data set which is anonymized, but then you look at other data sets and see if there are matches of characteristics. So for instance, if you have 2 IP addresses and you see a person that has access, let's say, a resource on the web from these 2 IP addresses more often, that it turns out that uniquely identifies an individual, because it's the work IP address and the home IP address. So there are very few people that share those 2 characteristics. So if you have access to the IP information, then you can de-anonymize, let's say, traffic information. So how do you protect yourself, or how do you protect the data that we store in our data, our data lake against that? And there are various techniques. Masking obviously is one, but it's a weak one. It means just covering some aspects of the protected information. Pseudonymization, of course, it's try to replace it with pseudonyms like Jon Snow. That's also very weak, doesn't really help you that much, because even though it removes the name, the characteristics remain the same, so it's easy to match with something else. But what you can do, though, and what Apple has started to do with the new operating system, when they collect information from your device, in order to ensure that it's anonymous and it's hard to re-identify, they add a little bit of noise to the data that comes from your device. And they do this because, again, it makes it a lot harder if it's not exact. Right? If the characteristics are not exact and they do not exactly match another data set, then it's way harder to identify. Or you're not 100% sure that that person is the person that's being identified. Right? So you add noise. What you can also do is just store 95% of the data. Just do a sample, a big sample of the data. So instead of storing 100%, you just store 95%. But what that does is that it gives an attacker, a potential attacker, a doubt that a particular record is actually in the database. So not knowing that a particular record is in fact in the database, it makes it a lot harder to crack it and to do the matching. There's also rounding. So in many situations, if you want to do a statistical analysis on the data set that you have in your data lake or your data lab, if you don't need precise results, and you can just look at the, let's say, overall statistical characteristics of a data set, then rounding up at certain locations makes it a lot harder. So, 1.945 is definitely more precise, and it's easier to identify a particular individual than 2% broad. And there's also something called the k-anonymity, where you, by design, you store only data sets that where you make sure that there are at least k individuals in the population that share all properties, right? And there's a tool called Google Rapport, which I'm going to talk about. Actually, let's talk about right now. That helps you do this for mobile devices, and they're doing it there. This is an open source project that you can use whenever you ingest data from an IoT device, in order to calculate how much randomness you can add to the data set, to the data that you upload. Google helps you do that. So this tool will help you calculate the amplitude of the randomness that you can do. And those 2 images show you that the characteristics of the data set from a statistical point of view is kept, but because of the randomness that has been added, it's a lot harder to identify a particular individual. So another technology, and I'm going to switch back, another technology that you can use to do the anonymization and pseudonymization and everything that I've been talking about is a technology called Streamsets that you all can use. And it's like Apache NiFi. It's a tool that we use a lot in production to connect data sources in your organization. So whenever you get data from those data sources, you anonymize the data at the source when you're doing this migration. And Streamsets is a technology that can help you do that. It's very easy to use and it's open source, and just drag and drop and put some blocks in the flow, and you say, hey, I want to remove this field or that field, and mask it and do other stuff. It doesn't support rapport, but it's still very useful. Okay, so this is also, I think for me personally, is very interesting, the profiling, the view of GDPR on profiling and what you can now do or cannot do. And before I get started, just a really good question. Who recognizes this image? I know it's a little bit blurred, but does anybody know what that is? Any point? No? No? So that's a random forest representation, crude representation of random forest algorithm. There are little forests, decision trees, and then multiples, right? And one of the principles that GDPR imposes is that when profiling is done, that it will have a legal effect. So assume I'm doing profiling so that I can calculate your score to give you credit, or calculate your insurance premium. So if I'm doing that, what GDPR says is that you need to be able to explain what happens, what's the business logic behind your algorithm. Why do you do this and why do you do that? And at times, these sort of algorithms, which are black box sort of algorithms for normal mortals, it is hard to do that. So that's going to be a problem, I think, for a lot of organizations to be able to explain what are the processes behind making an automated decision. Because GDPR tells you you cannot make an automated decision that has a legal effect unless the customer is aware of the implications of that, and that and unless the customer has the ability to ask a human to intervene and actually do the calculation, and unless we can reasonably explain it to our customers. So that's going to be a challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations. But what GDPR says is that you don't need to explain the algorithm, the precise algorithm. You just need to explain why you're doing it and how, in general terms, it works. So I think there's a space there for us to work with. But it's going to be a gray area, I think. Also, what's very, very important, apparently there's a GDPR rule that says whenever you design profiling algorithm, you need to design it from the get-go so that it prevents discrimination in any form. So you need to embed that logic in your profiling system. Because if, again, I've told you that if a data set includes some form of racial bias, you need to filter it out in your algorithm. You need to make sure that that does not happen. That it does not infer from the circle of friends that you have who you are, what race you have, what sexual orientation you have, and doesn't make decisions based on that. Because if it does, you're in breach. Besides the fact that it's a complicated ethical situation, you're also in breach of GDPR. You cannot do that. You need to protect your users from effects of those situations from the get-go, by design. So when you design the algorithm, you need to think about it and help the so-called data subjects. Also very important, you always need, so this is something that has always been around, but now it's enforced. You need to have explicit consent whenever profiling is used for direct marketing. Direct marketing means if you send out a personalized email, or you do a personalized profiling-based ad somewhere, then you need to have consent from the customer. So the customers will need to be able to say, yes, I agree to have me profiled, and I agree that you will give me personalized information based on my profile. And also, the customers will be able to, and we need to provide our customers the ability to opt out of these mechanisms. So that's going to be interesting. So the question is, how do we do that? And one of the challenges around obtaining consent for the data that we use for profiling is that first of all, something that people tend to forget is that observed data about the customers is still a form of personal data. And that's really important, because if I just observe the behavior of a customer by looking at purchase behavior, that can have a lot of personal information in there. if I can shop for specific items with the sexual nature or connotation, that can lead to an infer of my sexual orientation. So by default, by design, whenever we define the algorithms, we should try to avoid collecting that information if it has that effect. So what GDPR says is that you got to explain your customer that when they opt in, right? So it needs to be explicit opt-in, which means you cannot have a checkbox that's already ticked and that by continuing I agree to sell my kidneys and blah blah and all the stuff that we currently do. We need to be explicit. And also GDPR tells you that you need to explicitly and explain what you're going to do with the data in the terms that he will understand, right? So that's going to be problematic, I think, because it is very hard for them to give consent for a lot of sites out there if they are different from each other and if there are multiple items that needs to be checked, because you need to present your customer apparently with a list of all the external services that you share your data with and the reasons for doing that, and the customer needs to opt in for each of them and opt out at a later point in time. So there is talk about creating some form of standardized way of displaying the rights and what those particular uses will be, like we have in the in the food industry. Or we have a label on the back that more or less we can read. That's standard. That's imposed by the regulation. Apparently, we will need to have that sort of thing on the websites as well. We will need to be able to use, and there's talk about standardized icons, like you have when you select the on the mobile device, when you say an application, I want you to send me notifications, but I don't want you to have access to my GPS information, and I want you to have access to my contact information, my calendar. It's about the same. You should be able to easily opt in and opt out of a particular thing that's being done with the data that you have. And I think that's going to be it's going to be complicated, and it will drive a lot of changes in our websites. But I think it will be for the best, because in the end, it is done to protect the users from these situations in much in the same way you protect users from using some form of medicine. So before we get to questions, I have a slide movie that I want to show you. Who has seen Channel 4's Viewer Promise? Does it sound? Okay, cool. So I want to put that on. I think it will be relevant from what I'm trying to say is that this is an example on how you can treat this situation and use it for good, and trying to use it for marketing purposes and turn it from a problematic interaction with your website into something that can be useful and interesting. So let's see if this works. Oops, there's no sound.
At Channel 4, we're deeply and passionately in love. We're in love with you, you lovely viewers, and we love making programs for you. We're so in love, we want to get to know you even better. Because to give you more of your favourite shows and not your mum's or your mate Steve's, it helps to know who you are and what you like. So, if you sign up with Channel 4 on, say, 4OD, we'll ask you for your name, email address, and a few other details. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why should you give us your name and inside leg measurement? What will we do with that information? Let me put your mind at rest. When it comes to your details, we'll make you this promise. You control any personal information you give us. We'll never sell them to anyone. We won't clutter your email with stuff you don't want. And if you ever want the details you've given us back, we'll wipe them from our system. And you'll never hear from us again. Of course, having a better idea of who's watching our shows does attract advertisers too, which helps us make even more shows. In case you didn't know, Channel 4 is a not-for-profit organisation. So, the money we make from advertising doesn't go into the pockets of shareholders. It goes into creating more great programmes we think you'll love. But like I said before, even though we're madly in love with you, you're the one who's always in control. You naughty little things.
For more information about Channel 4's viewer promise, go to channel4.com/4viewers.
Right. So one last thing. So I think the conclusion of my research into GDPR and my interaction so far is that it looks like us as data scientists and big data architects need to be taught at one point how to operate heavy machinery, because big data is like a bulldozer at times. You can use it to do a lot of damage around you if you're not careful. So you need to be instructed, you need to be aware of the risks. And there's a lot of kids which are nowadays data scientists, which is great, but somebody needs to make sure that they are not, by means of big data, doing harm in the world rather than doing good. So we need to have a little bit more control, and I think this is why GDPR was introduced. It was the moment when legislation was required to just make, it's like when traffic laws was introduced, right? They introduced it because accidents started to happen, and it was the time, and right now is the time to take big data from, let's say, something that's just used for hobbies into the mainstream, and there was a need for regulation, and I think that's why GDPR was introduced. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, sure. Do you have any questions? Please.
Hey, Apache Atlas looks really interesting. I've just been Googling it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anyone who's doing anything similar that isn't Hadoop based?
I know Talent does that, Informatica does that. I think those are the biggest players which are not Hadoop based, and they're commercial.
So no open source ones?
No, I think I know another company, but I think Apache Atlas is the most evolved one at this point. But I'm sure that we're going to see a lot more popping up. Anybody else? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.